1236. Somewhere on the eastern bank of the Volga River, a city is burning, not smouldering, not fading. Burning the way only a city burns when someone decides it must. Fires set on purpose. Screaming has stopped in most of the streets. Smoke turns noon to dusk. The only sounds now are collapsing timbers and the distant noise of an army moving on. The city is called Bulgar, and for 300 years it was one of the most remarkable places on earth. Merchants from Baghdad knew this city. Viking traders from the north had passed through its gates. It sat at the crossroads of everything: the Volga River running south toward the Caspian, the Kama River joining from the northeast, and for centuries that geography meant money, influence, and power. The mosques here were real mosques with educated clergy who had studied in the great schools of the Islamic world. The bazaars were stocked with furs from the Arctic, silver from Central Asia, and silk that had traveled overland from China. This was not some forgotten backwater. This was a civilization. A Muslim Turkic civilization, in the middle of what we today call Russia, predating the Christianization of Kievan Rus by 66 years. And now it is burning. Stand at the edge of that city in autumn 1236. If you see past the smoke, you watch the end of something most of the world has forgotten. You witness the result of 13 years of planning and patience by a military machine unlike any the medieval world had seen or would see again. You would also be watching the opening move of a campaign that within 5 years would reach the Adriatic Sea. These are the things worth understanding about this moment. The people who built Bolghar had done something that almost no one else in the 13th century had managed to do. They had beaten the Mongols, not in some minor skirmish. In a real battle with real consequences against two of the greatest generals Genghis Khan ever produced. They set a trap, they sprang it perfectly, and they sent those riders south without achieving their objective. That was 1223. This is 1236. 13 years later, and Batu Khan and Subutai. Yes, Subutai, again now in his 60s, and still the sharpest military mind in the world, have returned with everyone, with a coalition of Genghisid princes from across the empire, with a siege train built from the experience of cracking open the walls of Chinese cities and Central Asian fortresses, with a logistical apparatus that had been planning this specific operation for the better part of a decade. So before we watch this city fall, let's back up. Let's talk about who these people actually were, why they mattered, and how a nation that once humiliated the Mongol Empire ended up here in ashes in the autumn light at the hinge point of one of the most consequential military campaigns in medieval history. Because the road to Vienna, to Poland, to the gates of Western Europe, ran right through Bulgar. And most people have never heard of the place. Let's get something straight right away, because this trips people up every time. When we say Volga Bulgaria, we are not talking about the Bulgaria on the map. We are not talking about the country in the Balkans, the one with the Black Sea coast, the Orthodox churches, and the long history of Slavic identity. That Bulgaria, the Danubian one, is a separate story, descended from a separate migration of the same original Turkic Bulgar tribes centuries earlier. Different branch of the family tree, different geography, different religion, different fate. Volga Bulgaria is something else entirely. It is a Muslim Turkic state located in what is today the Republic of Tatarstan in Russia, right at the confluence of the Volga and Kama rivers, roughly where the modern city of Kazan sits. It existed from roughly the late 9th century until the moment we are discussing, and in its prime, it was extraordinary in ways that the standard history curriculum has never adequately acknowledged. Start with the cities. Bilyar, which served as the capital for much of the 12th and early 13th centuries, after Russian raids forced the Bulgars to move their seat of power inland, reportedly had a population exceeding 100,000 people. Russian chronicles called it the Veliki Gorod, the Great City. 100,000 people in medieval Eurasia was not a small number. London, in the year 1200, had perhaps 25,000 inhabitants. Paris was larger, but not by a staggering margin. The great cities of the Islamic world, Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, were genuinely enormous, but they were exceptions in a world where most urban populations were counted in the tens of thousands. Bulgar was by any honest measure one of the biggest cities in the medieval world north of the Caucasus. And almost no one outside of specialist scholarship knows it existed. Bolghar, the original capital on the Volga, was the commercial heart of this state, a city that medieval sources compared in size and wealth to the greatest centers of the Islamic world. Its trade network was genuinely global by the standards of the time. To the north, Viking merchants from Scandinavia, fur traders from the Arctic peoples of Ugra and the Nenets. To the south, the markets of Baghdad, Constantinople, and the Caspian ports. To the west, the Russian principalities, and through them, Central and Western Europe. To the east, the steppe routes into Central Asia and ultimately China. Bolghar was the middleman for an entire hemisphere, and it charged accordingly. The key to understanding Volga Bulgaria is the combination of geography and religion. The geography gave them the trade monopoly. The religion gave them the institutional framework to manage a complex multi-ethnic state and to participate in the broader Islamic world's networks of commerce, scholarship, and diplomacy. In 922, 66 years before Kyiv Rus accepted Christianity, while the Russians were still predominantly pagan, the Bulgar Khan Almish Iltabar sent an ambassador south to the Abbasid Caliph al-Muqtadir in Baghdad. The request was formal: send scholars to instruct us in Islam and funds to help us build a fortress against our enemies. The Caliph sent an embassy in response. The famous traveller Ahmad ibn Fadlan was part of that embassy, and his account of the journey up the Volga is one of the most vivid and detailed travel narratives to survive from the medieval period. He describes the Bulgars, their customs, their climate, and their practices. He is not writing about a primitive people. He is writing about a sophisticated state that has made a strategic decision to join the civilized world. The conversion to Islam was smart politics as much as genuine faith. It connected Volga Bulgaria to the vast commercial and diplomatic network of the Islamic world. It gave the Bulgarian ruling class access to Arabic literacy, Arabic scholarship, Arabic accounting and legal systems, all of which made running a complex trading state easier, and it provided a shared religious identity that helped bind together a population that was ethnically diverse Turkic Bulgars, alongside Finno-Ugric peoples, Slavic settlers, and Varangian traders. Under the umbrella of Islam, these groups could coexist and cooperate in ways that pure ethnic identity could never have sustained. The economic engine was the fur trade. The great forests north of the Volga-Kama region, today's Siberia and subarctic Russia, were the primary source of high-quality furs for the entire medieval world. Ermine sable marten beaver pelts that commanded extraordinary prices in the markets of the Islamic world and Byzantine Constantinople. The hunters and trappers who produced these furs were the Ugra, the Nenets, and other northern peoples. The route south ran down the rivers into Volga Bulgaria, where the furs were traded, taxed, and bundled for onward shipment. Volga Bulgaria sat at the choke point and collected its toll on every transaction. The silver that flowed back north through Bolghar in exchange for those furs has left a remarkable archaeological trail. Kufic dirhams, the silver coins of the Islamic world, have been found in Viking burial mounds in Sweden and Norway, in hoards along the Baltic coast, in the ruins of Scandinavian trading centres like Hedeby and Birka. Many of those coins passed through Bolghar. The city essentially ran the silver pipeline that kept the northern European economy liquid during the 9th and 10th centuries, before German silver mines opened up alternative sources. But here is the thing that the history books rarely mention when they do get around to discussing Volga Bulgaria, which is not often. By the time the Mongols appeared, this state had already been weakened. Seriously weakened. Not by internal decay or mismanagement, but by a century of systematic military pressure from Vladimir Suzdal, the Russian principality, to the west. The princes of Vladimir had been raiding, attacking, and chipping away at Bulgar territory since at least the 11th century. Multiple campaigns, captured towns, burned villages, disrupted trade routes. By the early 13th century, the situation had become severe enough that the Bulgars had been forced to abandon Bolghar as their main capital and relocate the seat of government to Bulgar, further from the rivers and further from the Russian raiding corridors. In 1220, just 3 years before the Mongols first appeared on the southern horizon, the Grand Duke Yuri II of Vladimir captured Ustyug and besieged the important Bulgar town of Oshil, gaining access to Volga Bulgaria's northern trade routes and cutting into the fur business that had been the country's lifeblood for 3 centuries. When assessing what happened in 1236, we need to keep this context in mind. The Mongols did not arrive to face Volga Bulgaria at the peak of its strength. They arrived to face a country that had been bled by decades of warfare, that had lost territory and revenue and strategic depth, and whose military had been put under constant pressure from the west, even as the far more dangerous threat was building in the east. That matters for understanding why the final conquest moved so fast. And it matters for understanding what the Bulgars were up against, not just the Mongol army, but the cumulative weight of everything that had been done to them before the Mongols ever arrived. You already know the broad outlines of Subutai and Jebi's Great Western Raid. If you follow this channel, we've covered the Battle of Kalka River, that extraordinary moment in May 1223, when the combined forces of the Cumans and multiple Russian princes, somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 men, depending on which source you trust, were annihilated on the banks of a small river near the Azov Sea by a Mongol force that had spent 2 years riding across the Caucasus, Georgia, and the Pontic steppe. It was one of the most audacious military operations in history. 2 Tumans, roughly 20,000 men sent by Genghis Khan on what was essentially a reconnaissance in force of the entire Western world. Go west. See what's there. Beat everyone you encounter. Come back with intelligence. Subutai and Jebi did exactly that. They fought the Georgians and won. They fought the Cumans and won. They fought the Alans and won. They fought the Russian princes and their Cuman allies at Kalka, and won so completely that several princes were captured, placed under boards, and suffocated as the Mongols held their victory feast on top of them, a way of killing enemies without spilling noble blood, which Mongol tradition considered taboo. By the autumn of 1223, this force was heading home, exhausted, rich with plunder and intelligence, having ranged further west than any Mongol army before them. Subutai and Jebi turned east toward Mongolia. But Genghis Khan's original orders had included a directive on the return journey: engage the Volga Bulgars. The Bulgars controlled the Middle Volga corridor, which was both a critical route home and a major strategic border zone for whatever the Mongols planned next in the west. It made sense to assess them, probe their defenses, and test their capabilities. Subutai and Jebi moved against the southern border of Volga Bulgaria in the autumn of 1223. They were joined at some point in this operation by forces under Yoshi Genghis Khan's eldest son, Batu's father, who had been supposed to link up with the raiding force earlier and had been conspicuously absent during much of the Western campaign. The reasons for that absence and what it meant for Yoshi's relationship with his father are a whole story in themselves. But by the time the Volga was reached, Yoshi's forces were present. What happened next is one of the great reversals of medieval military history and also one of the most debated. Our primary source is Ibn al-Athir, an Arab historian working in Mosul, a city more than 1,800 kilometers from the battlefield. He was not there. He was working from accounts that had traveled through the Islamic news networks of the time, passed from traveler to merchant to scribe before reaching him. His account is brief, perhaps 2 paragraphs, but it is specific in its description of the tactical sequence, and most historians regard it as credible in its core claims. The Bulgars, Ibn al-Athir writes, heard that the Mongols were coming. They were not surprised. They had time to prepare. They laid ambushes in multiple locations. Then they marched out to meet the enemy, not to fight them in open battle, but to draw them in. They showed the Mongols a force that appeared to be retreating. The Mongols, fresh from 2 years of victories against every opponent they encountered, pursued. The retreating Bulgars led them past the prepared ambush positions. Then the trap closed. Forces emerged from behind the Mongols, cutting off the retreat. The encirclement was complete. Ibn al-Athir's words, they fell to the sword on every side. Most were killed. Only a few escaped. The Khwarezmian historian al-Nasawi adds a detail that I find genuinely remarkable. The Mongol prisoners who were captured alive during this engagement were not executed, as was standard practice, and not sold into slavery immediately. Instead, they were returned to Genghis Khan, sent east under escort, in exchange for livestock. The exchange rate al-Nasawi specifies was 1 Mongol captive for 1 ram, a live soldier in exchange for a sheep. That ratio tells you something about relative power in the moment, and the fact that the Bulgars chose to send prisoners back, rather than execute them, tells you something about their political sophistication. They were not just fighting a battle, they were sending a message to Genghis Khan about what kind of state they were. Now, the debate among historians is about scale and command. Some argue that only a portion of the Mongol force was ambushed, perhaps a vanguard, or an advanced screening element, not the main body. This interpretation notes that the Mongols, after this reversal, continued eastward and successfully defeated the eastern Cumans and Kanglis on the way home, which would suggest they still had substantial fighting power. If the entire army had been mauled at Samara Bend, that subsequent operation would have been difficult. Historian Peter Jackson, one of the leading scholars on this period, sees no compelling reason to doubt Ibn al-Athir's core account. Historian Zimony Istvan states directly the Mongols were trapped and defeated by the Volga Bulgars. The debate about scale does not change the fundamental result. The Mongol operation against Volga Bulgaria in 1223 failed to achieve its objective. The main cities were not taken. The state was not subdued. The army turned around and went home. The man who organized the Bulgar defense was the Iltabar, or king named Gabdullah Chelbir. His forces were augmented by the armies of the Mordvin princes Puresh and Pergaz, leaders of the Finno-Ugric Mordvin peoples who lived to the west of Volga Bulgaria and were within the Bulgars' sphere of political influence. The coordination of multiple forces in a complex ambush operation suggests a level of military planning that we should not underestimate. The feigned retreat in particular was a tactic that required disciplined soldiers who could run away convincingly, while staying in formation soldiers who would not actually flee when the pressure became intense. That is harder than it sounds. It requires training, trust in the plan, and nerves. Word of this outcome spread through the Islamic world. Ibn al-Athir wrote about it in Mosul. Al-Nasawi wrote about it. The Bulgars had stopped the army that everyone thought was unstoppable. For a Muslim state living in the shadow of an expanding pagan empire, this was not just a military victory. It was a statement about what was possible. And it was a statement that Subutai spent the next 13 years thinking about how to answer. Here is the thing about Subutai that defines his entire career. He never stopped learning. Every battle he fought, won or lost, became data. The Samara Bend was data. The Bulgars' use of terrain, their feigned retreat, their ability to coordinate multiple forces in a complex ambush, all of that went into his mental model of what he was dealing with. When he came back in 1236, he came back with a plan specifically designed to neutralize every advantage the Bulgars had demonstrated in 1223. That is what we mean when we talk about Mongol strategic patience. It is not passive waiting. It is active preparation, learning and planning over timescales that most medieval commanders never even contemplated. If you're not subscribed to this channel yet, now is a good time to fix that. We go deep on these campaigns, the real mechanics of how they were planned, how they were fought, and why they succeeded or failed. Hit the subscribe button and you won't miss the next one. After the Battle of Samara Bend, the Mongols did not return immediately. They had too much else to do, and Volga Bulgaria, while on the list, was not the only problem that needed solving. Genghis Khan himself died in 1227, campaigning against the Tangut Kingdom of Western Xia. The succession process took time. When Ogedei Khan was formally elected, Great Khan at the Kurultai of 1229, he inherited both the empire and its unfinished business. And the unfinished business was extensive. Northern China, the Jin dynasty, was still fighting. Persia needed further consolidation. The Western Steppe was restless. Volga Bulgaria would have to wait its turn. But it would not be forgotten. In that same year of 1229, Ogaday dispatched a force westward under two commanders named Kukday and Bubaday. This was not an invasion. It was a probe, a systematic professional reconnaissance in force designed to update the intelligence picture that Subutai had gathered in 1221 to 1223 and to begin the methodical process of reducing Volga Bulgaria's defensive capacity. Kukday and Bubaday crossed the Ural River, the eastern boundary of the Bulgar sphere of influence, and defeated the Bulgar frontier guards stationed there. They moved into the upper Ural Valley and established a Mongol presence. Then they stopped. They did not push to the main cities. They did not attempt to cross the Volga. They accomplished what they came to accomplish. They established a forward position and demonstrated that the eastern approaches to Volga Bulgaria could be penetrated. 3 years later, in 1232, a larger Mongol force swept through the southeastern portion of Bashkiria, the territory between the Ural Mountains and the Volga, which was nominally within the Bulgar sphere, and occupied the southern fringes of Volga Bulgarian territory itself. Again, the main cities were not attacked, but the occupied territory was expanded. The Mongol forward line moved closer, and the Bashkir peoples caught between Mongol power to the east and Bulgar influence to the west were being progressively drawn into the Mongol orbit, which meant they would eventually supply cavalry and local knowledge to the final campaign. Throughout this period, the Bulgars fought back intelligently. They had learned from 1223 that they could not beat the Mongols in open battle on flat terrain. Mongol composite archery and cavalry tactics were simply too effective in that environment. So they did not try. They relied on their fortified cities, which were genuinely formidable obstacles. They used the forests and rivers of their territory, which were not ideal for Mongol cavalry operations. They employed guerrilla harassment of Mongol raiding parties. They kept their main military force intact behind walls, rather than sacrificing it in the open. This was smart. And in the limited context of each individual probe, it worked. The Mongols' operations in 1229 and 1232 did not capture Bilyar, did not take Bolghar, did not break the political structure of the state. By any narrow tactical measure, the Bulgars were managing the threat, but they were losing the strategic picture. Each Mongol probe established a new forward position, extended a new occupation zone, and stripped away another layer of the buffer territory that had previously protected the core cities. By 1234, the Mongol lines were significantly closer to Bilyar and Bolghar than they had been in 1229. The frontier guards were gone. The outlying territories were occupied. The Bashkirs were becoming Mongol auxiliaries rather than Bulgar dependents. The state was shrinking under pressure, even without its capital cities being directly attacked. And the Bulgars were fighting this rearguard action alone. That is perhaps the most important and most tragic aspect of their situation. The Russian principalities to the west had been their enemies for a century. The princes of Vladimir Suzdal had been doing to Volga Bulgaria in the west exactly what the Mongols were beginning to do in the east. There was no prospect of a Russian-Bulgar alliance against the Mongol threat. The shared danger did not produce shared action. Each side watched the other's predicament and calculated its own advantage right up until the moment the Mongols arrived on both their doorsteps in sequence. In 1234, Ogaday Khan issued his general mobilization decree. The secret history of the Mongols preserves its language. Every household across the empire, from the greatest princes to the smallest commoners, was required to send its eldest son to the coming campaign. The mobilization language was total and explicit. This was not a call for volunteers. This was imperial conscription on a civilizational scale. Subutai, meanwhile, had spent the years since 1223 campaigning in western China and continuing to develop the tactical thinking that would define the 1236 operation. He had also been processing the intelligence from the 1229 and 1232 probes, building a detailed operational picture of Volga Bulgaria's defenses, where the strong points were where the approaches were most viable, what the Bulgars would do when attacked from different directions. When the mobilization decree came down and the army began to assemble, he had a plan, not a rough plan, a specific detailed multi-phase operational plan that accounted for the specific ways the Bulgars had resisted and neutralized those ways one by one. The Bulgars had 13 years of warning. They used them as well as they could. It was not going to be enough. In 1235, at a location called Dalan near Karakorum, the Mongol imperial capital on the Mongolian steppe, the largest assembly of Genghisid princes in a generation gathered for a Kurultai. The agenda, bluntly stated, was the conquest of the world. Ögedei Khan had just overseen the final destruction of the Jurchen Jin dynasty in northern China the previous year, 1234. The war that Genghis Khan had begun against the Jin had lasted more than 2 decades, consumed enormous resources, and claimed the lives of more people than most medieval wars can even contemplate. Now it was done. The Jin emperor was dead. Northern China was Mongol territory. The Eastern Front was for the moment stabilized. The Mongol war machine needed a new target. And there was never any real debate about what that target would be. Subutai had been advocating for a comprehensive Western campaign for over a decade. He had the intelligence. He had the operational plans. He had spent the years since 1223 building the case that the West Russia, the steppe peoples, and ultimately Europe was conquerable with sufficient force and proper preparation. The Kurultai of 1235 was the moment when that advocacy became imperial policy. The decision made at Dalandava was stated in the grandest possible terms: conquer to the last sea. Push west until there was no more west to push against. The Atlantic Ocean, if the army could reach it. This was not rhetorical. The Mongols genuinely believed they had a divine mandate to rule the world. The concept of the Tengri-given right to universal dominion was core to Mongol political theology, and Ögedei was prepared to commit the resources necessary to act on that belief. The roster of princes who came to Dalandava and pledged themselves to the Western campaign reads like a genealogical chart of the entire Genghisid dynasty. Batu Khan, son of Jochi, grandson of Genghis, ruler of the westernmost Mongol territories, was appointed nominal supreme commander. The decision to give Batu this role was not purely military, it was political. The Yochid branch of the Genghisid family had historically been somewhat sidelined in military command, partly because of the lingering question about Jochi's paternity. Genghis Khan himself had questioned whether Jochi was truly his son, a suspicion that had poisoned the relationship between father and eldest son until Jochi's death in 1227. Batu had grown up in the shadow of that stigma. The Kurultai of 1235 was, among other things, a rehabilitation of the Jochid line. Accompanying Batu were Guyuk, son of Ögedei, and a future great Khan, who personally despised Batu and would maintain that rivalry for the rest of his life, but who came to the campaign because Ögedei ordered it. Munka, son of Tolui, another future great Khan, who was by many accounts the most capable of the Genghisid princes of his generation, and who would demonstrate that capability in the Russian campaigns. Baidar and Buri from the Chagatai line. Order Shiban Tankut, Berka Batu's brothers from the Jochi line, giving the Jochids a numerical plurality in the senior command structure, and the son of Genghis Khan's youngest son, Kulkan, added the direct paternal line to the campaign's prestige roster. The presence of so many senior princes in one campaign was unusual, even by Mongol standards. Ögedei had apparently made a deliberate decision to send the next generation of leadership to serve under Subutai, before the old general died, to let them learn from the best in the most demanding operational environment available. Whatever the rationale, it created a command structure of enormous collective weight. And then there was Subutai, always Subutai, nominally subordinate to Batu, actually the operational brain of everything that followed. He was somewhere between 60 and 65 years old at this point, ancient by the standards of medieval military commanders, most of whom did not survive long enough to accumulate anything like his experience. He had been campaigning continuously for 40 years. He had fought in China, Central Asia, Persia, Georgia, and Russia. He had personal knowledge of the Western steppe and its peoples that no other living commander possessed, and he had been thinking about how to finish the job that 1223 had left incomplete for over a decade. The political dimension of the 1235 Kurultai deserves one more note because it echoes forward through centuries of Eurasian history. The lands that the Western campaign would conquer would become the Ulus Jochi Batu's domain. the territory to which the Jochid branch of the family held rights under the Mongol law of appanage. Because Batu was nominal commander, and because the Jochid princes made up the largest block of the senior command, the territorial fruits of the campaign would flow primarily to them. This is why, in the decades after 1241, the Golden Horde emerged as the dominant Mongol power in the West. The Kurultai of 1235 was not just a military planning session. It was the moment when the future political map of Eastern Europe and the Russian steppe was determined 2 centuries in advance. Throughout the winter of 1235 to 1236, the assembled force gathered on the Caspian steppe, the great grassland east of the Caspian Sea that had served as the Mongol staging area for Western operations before. The Bashkir tribes were subjugated, and their eldest sons were pressed into service as auxiliary cavalry. Supply lines were established. Intelligence from the 1229 and 1232 probes was reviewed and updated. The army that materialized was not a horde in the pejorative sense, not a mass of undisciplined horsemen moving in vague directions. It was a professional military force with a specific operational plan, moving toward a specific objective, with logistics calculated to sustain it through a multi-year campaign. Volga Bulgaria was first on the list, and Subutai had decided exactly how he was going to take it. The first question any good general asks when facing a known enemy is, what did they do last time? And the second question is, how do I make sure they cannot do it again? Subutai had very clear answers to both questions regarding the Volga Bulgaria. In 1223, the Bulgars had used a feigned retreat to draw a Mongol force into a prepared ambush. The tactic worked because the Mongols pursued aggressively. Their entire doctrine was based on speed and relentless pressure, and an enemy that appeared to be running away invited exactly the kind of aggressive pursuit that led them into the trap. The Bulgars also demonstrated excellent knowledge of their own terrain, particularly the river bends and forest margins that created natural choke points along the approaches from the south. And they showed the ability to coordinate multiple forces, their own troops, plus Mordvin auxiliaries, in a complex multi-stage operation. These were not simple fighters. These were sophisticated military planners. Against this profile, a simple frontal assault from a single direction was the worst possible approach. It would play to every Bulgar strength terrain knowledge, prepared positions, feigned withdrawal, coordinated ambush. The Bulgars had spent 13 years since 1223, improving those defenses, identifying the most likely approach corridors from the south and west, and stationing their available forces accordingly. Subutai's solution was a double-envelopment, a 2-pronged attack, designed to stretch the Bulgar defensive system beyond its capacity to respond coherently. The Western force, the larger, more visible element of the operation, advanced along the familiar approach corridors from the south and west, following the routes that previous Mongol probes had used. This force was visible and loud. Its job was to be seen, to attract Bulgarian attention, to force the main Bulgar defensive posture to orient southward and westward, to commit garrison forces to the known threat axes, and to fix the Bulgar military in place. Meanwhile, a second Mongol force crossed the Ural Mountains. Not around the Urals along the familiar southern steppe route, through them using mountain passes that Mongol scouts had identified and assessed during the operations of 1229 and 1232. This eastern column emerged on the flank and rear of the Bulgar defensive system, approaching from a direction the Bulgars had invested far less in defending. The mountains that formed the natural eastern boundary of Volga Bulgarian territory were not primarily a military frontier. They were a trade route barrier, the border between the Bulgar agricultural zone and the steppe peoples to the east. There were no major fortifications there, no prepared ambush positions, no concentrated garrison forces. Think about what this means for the defenders. The Bulgar military commander, whoever held that role in 1236, wakes up one morning to reports that a large Mongol force is advancing from the expected directions in the south and west. He deploys his forces accordingly. He prepares the defensive positions that have been planned for years. And then almost simultaneously reports come in that a second army has appeared from the east, from behind the Urals, from the direction nobody was primarily watching. The coordination required to respond to two simultaneous threats from opposite directions without central communications technology with armies that moved on foot and horseback was extraordinarily difficult. The Bulgarian command system would have been overwhelmed. The psychological dimension compounded the tactical problem. Years of Mongol raiding from the south and Russian pressure from the west had conditioned the Bulgar military mind to think about threats along those axes. The eastern mountains felt safe, they always had. Trade came from the east. Danger came from the south and west. When that assumption was violated, when the threat materialized from behind the mountains, the cognitive disruption would have been severe. Soldiers who are told to hold a line against an expected enemy in an expected direction do not pivot smoothly when a different enemy appears from an unexpected direction. Panic spreads. Units lose cohesion. Commanders lose communication with their troops. And in that window of disruption, Subutai's western force was advancing hard. The campaign moved with the speed that was Subutai's signature throughout his career. It began in late summer, 1236, when the ground was hard. The rivers were at their seasonal low, and the grass on the steppe was still plentiful enough to feed the Mongol horses. These logistical details were not incidental. Subutai chose this timing deliberately. A campaign that began in autumn and ran through winter would have different forage and crossing conditions, and the Mongols planned for all of it. Archaeology tells part of the story of what followed. At site after site, in the forest steppe zone south of the Kama River, excavated by Russian and Soviet archaeologists over the past century and a half, the stratigraphic record shows fire layers. Thick bands of ash and charcoal at the habitation level. Human remains in and around structures, sometimes in postures suggesting people who were killed where they stood, rather than buried in organized cemeteries. Artifacts consistent with violent destruction rather than abandonment. These are not the signatures of cities that were evacuated. They are the signatures of cities that were attacked, burned and depopulated in sudden violent events. Bilyar fell first. The administrative capital. The great city of 100,000 people, the seat of Bulgar government, and the hub of military command coordination. Its fall was not just the loss of a city, it was a command and control catastrophe for the entire state. With the capital gone, the ability of Bulgar commanders across the territory to receive orders, coordinate movements, and act as a coherent military force was shattered. Local commanders would now be making independent decisions, cut off from central direction, watching their patron state collapse around them. Allied peoples, the Mordvins, the remaining Bashkirs, the smaller Finno-Ugric groups that had been within the Bulgar sphere, would now be calculating whether loyalty to a dying state was still worth its cost. Then, Bolghar, the commercial capital on the Volga. The siege train that the Mongols brought to these walls was the product of generations of accumulated knowledge from Chinese engineers, Persian siege masters, and the accumulated experience of the most effective military organization in the medieval world. Mangonels and trebuchets that could throw stones weighing hundreds of pounds against masonry at sustained rates. Naphtha projectors, fire weapons that could launch burning material over walls and into the structures within. These were the same categories of weapon that had cracked open the walls of Zhongdu, the Jin capital, and the great Central Asian cities of Samarkand and Merv. The walls of Bulgar, whatever their strength, were designed to resist the kind of attackers. Bulgar had previously faced Russian raiders with battering rams and ladders. They were not designed to resist this. The other Bulgarian cities fell in sequence: Suar-Jukatau, and the smaller fortifications scattered across the territory. The Laurentian Chronicle, the Russian chronicle source that gives us the most direct contemporary account, places the sacking of the main cities in the autumn of 1236. Later sources indicate the entire state was subdued by early 1237. A civilization 3 centuries in the making erased from the map in a matter of months. Let me try to make this real for a moment, because I think the scale of what happened here is easy to lose in the military analysis. Bolghar, in the autumn of 1236, was not a military installation. It was a city. It had a cathedral mosque where the call to prayer had sounded 5 times a day for over 3 centuries. It had schools, maktabs, where boys learned the Quran, and Arabic letters, madrasas, where older students worked through jurisprudence and mathematics, and the traditions of Islamic scholarship. It had a bazaar, where you could find Baltic amber brought south by Scandinavian traders, Russ's honey and beeswax, Central Asian cotton and Chinese silk that had changed hands a dozen times before arriving here. It had a postal quarter for foreign merchants in residence, a funduku in the Arabic tradition, where visiting traders could sleep store goods and conduct business. It had physicians. This is one of the details that strikes me most when I work through the sources on Volga Bulgaria. Archaeological excavations at Bulghar, the other great Bulgar city, have recovered medical instruments from the occupation levels, probes, scalpels, and specialized tools that match the catalogue of instruments described in Arabic medical texts of the era. The scholarly tradition that entered Volga Bulgaria with Islam in 922 was not limited to theology and law. It included the full corpus of Greco-Arabic medicine that Ibn Sina and his contemporaries had systematized, transmitted through the same trade networks that brought silver and silk. The Bulgar scholars whose works circulated in the broader Islamic world included the 11th century mathematician and polymath Burhan ad-Din al-Bulgari. These were people embedded in the intellectual life of the medieval Islamic world, not isolated provincials. There were also people in Bolghar in the autumn of 1236 who had no reason to expect what was coming, or who expected it in the abstract but had nowhere to go. Resident merchants from the Islamic south, craftsmen whose families had lived in the city for generations, women and children with no military role and no ability to influence the outcome, elderly people who had seen the city at its peak and were too old to flee. The Laurentian Chronicle gives us the record of what happened. Written down in 1377 but drawing on earlier materials, it provides this entry for the year 6744 in the Byzantine reckoning, 1236 in hours. There came from the countries of the east into the Bulgar lands the godless Tatars, and sacked the good city of Bolghar, and killed everyone from the old to the young, and the tiniest suckling, and looted a lot of goods, and set the city on fire, and captured the whole of their land. The tiniest suckling, that phrase. That, the chronicler is not being literary, he is reporting. And it is consistent with the pattern that the Mongol military system had established across a dozen campaigns, the pattern that made Mongol conquest so psychologically devastating to the people who experienced it and heard about it. The destruction was not random. It was not the byproduct of combat that got out of hand. It was policy calculated to leave no core of resistance, no population that would rise behind the advancing army, no seed of future opposition. The Mongols had learned from Genghis Khan's early campaigns against the nomadic tribes of Mongolia that incomplete victories bred future conflicts. Complete destruction did not. The archaeological record confirms what the chronicle describes. The excavated sites of Bolghar and the surrounding settlement areas, the destruction layers are not ambiguous. Fire damage throughout. Structural collapse, consistent with burning rather than gradual decay. Human remains in positions inconsistent with organized burial, people who died where they were not people whose bodies were later collected and interred. The demographic collapse in the region is written into the soil itself. The landscape essentially empties in the stratigraphic record after 1236, in the way that only mass death and mass flight together can produce. Some historians have estimated that over 80% of Volga Bulgaria's population did not survive the invasion. That number needs a moment to sit with you. 80%. 4 out of 5 people. If you imagine the population of a modern city, say a mid-sized American city of 500,000 people, and then imagine that 400,000 of those people are gone within a year, killed or scattered and never returning, you begin to get a sense of the scale. The social fabric that sustains a civilization, the people who know how to do things, the people who remember how things work, the people who teach the next generation, stripped away in a single campaign season. Not everyone died, of course. The Mongol system was not purely exterminatory. It had economic logic embedded in its brutality. Artisans, potters, blacksmiths, weavers, leather workers, construction specialists were identified and separated from the general population before the killing. They had transferable skills that the Mongol Empire could use elsewhere. Some were marched south to the lower Volga, where Batu Khan was beginning to build what would become Sarai, the capital of the Golden Horde. The craftsmen who had built the mosques and bazaars and caravanserais of Bolghar would now build the palaces and administrative buildings of a Mongol city. The nobility and administrative class that survived, and some did, particularly those in cities that fell quickly and submitted rather than resisting to the last, capitulated to Mongol overlordship. They had no rational alternative. The army was destroyed. The capital was burning. No allies were coming. Submission meant paying tribute, providing troops when demanded, and living under Mongol supervision. It was a humiliation, but it was survivable, and survival was the only remaining option. The people who escaped entirely fled north, into the forests along the Kama River and its tributaries, into the territory of modern Chuvashia and Tatarstan, where the dense forest cover made large-scale cavalry operations difficult, and where the Mongols, focused on their westward campaign, did not immediately pursue. These refugees carried with them their language, their Islamic faith, their craft traditions, their stories, and their memory of what Volga Bulgaria had been. The area around Kazan, previously settled mainly by Mari people, became the refuge zone where the Bulgar identity survived and eventually reconstituted itself. The Khanate of Kazan, which emerged in the 1430s, was in many ways the cultural heir of Volga Bulgaria, smaller, more modest, hemmed in by the growing power of Muscovite Russia, but carrying the flame forward. Today, the people of Tatarstan, the Volga Tatars, trace their cultural identity in part to this moment. They are the heirs of a civilization that was nearly destroyed and chose against the odds to persist. The UNESCO World Heritage inscription of the Bulgar archaeological complex in 2014 is the formal international acknowledgement of that heritage. Every year, Tatar Muslims make a pilgrimage to the ruins of Bulgar, the site their ancestors built on the Volga bank, sacred to them as the place where their forebears accepted Islam. But in the autumn of 1236, none of that future existed yet. There was only smoke silence and a Mongol army turning west. If this story is landing for you, if you're realizing, like I did when I first went deep on this material, that the Mongol Western campaign is so much richer and more complex than the usual, they rode in and destroyed everything. Summary: please hit the like button. This research takes real time, and your engagement is what makes it possible to keep going. Now let's follow the army. At this point, you might be asking a reasonable question, and it is one worth taking seriously. Why did the Mongols need to fully conquer Volga Bulgaria before moving west? Why not bypass it? The Russian principalities were the real prize on the road to Europe. Hungary and Poland were what Subutai had been planning toward for 15 years. Why spend an entire campaign season on the Bulgars, when the main objective was further west? The answer comes in 3 parts, and each part illuminates something important about how the Mongols actually thought about large-scale war. First, and most fundamentally, you never leave a hostile state behind you. This is not a Mongol-specific principle. It is one of the oldest precepts of strategic warfare, violated by commanders throughout history at their peril. Leaving Volga Bulgaria intact and unsubdued, while the main army pushed west into Russia, would have meant leaving a Muslim state with military capacity, with trade connections across the Islamic world, with enormous motivation for revenge, and most critically sitting directly astride the Volga River corridor that the Mongol army needed for logistics and communication. The Volga was not incidental to the operation. It was the spine. The river system connecting the Caspian steppe to the Russian interior was the primary route for supply movement, for messenger communication between the forward forces and the rear, and for the movement of reinforcements and replacement horses. A hostile Volga Bulgaria controlling the Middle Volga was a knife pointed at the back of any Western campaign. Every supply convoy, every messenger relay, every returning cavalry detachment would have to pass through or pass territory controlled by a state that had demonstrated in 1223 both the will and the ability to attack Mongol forces. Second, the logistical requirements of a multi-year Western campaign were immense, and the Volga corridor was central to meeting them. A Mongol army on campaign was not just soldiers, it was horses, tens of thousands of horses each, requiring substantial daily forage. The steppe grasslands along the Volga provided that forage. The river itself provided water and a navigation corridor for bulk supply movement. The territory of Volga Bulgaria sat across the middle of this corridor. Controlling it was not optional. It was the prerequisite for sustaining the army through the years of campaigning that Subutai planned to conduct in Russia and beyond. Third, and perhaps most underappreciated, psychology. The Bulgars had beaten the Mongols in 1223. That story had circulated for 13 years. The Russian princes knew it. The Kuman Khans knew it. The Hungarian king's intelligence network, such as it was, probably knew it. If the Mongols arrived at the borders of Russia having bypassed Volga Bulgaria, leaving it undefeated on their flank, every enemy they subsequently faced would have read that as evidence of limitation. It would have suggested that there were conditions under which the Mongol army could be stopped, that terrain or terrain knowledge could neutralize the Mongol tactical system, that resistance was possible and might succeed. The total comprehensive destruction of Volga Bulgaria sent precisely the opposite message. It announced to every principality and every kingdom from the Volga to the Atlantic that the 1223 victory was a temporary reprieve, not a permanent defense. It demonstrated that the Mongol system had learned, had adapted, and would return with sufficient force to overcome whatever had stopped it before. It was a message of inevitability, and it was received that way. The terror that preceded Mongol armies into Russia and Europe in 1237 to 1242 was not irrational. It was a sober assessment of what had just happened to the only people who had previously managed to stop them. There is one more figure worth introducing here, because he understood what was coming before almost anyone in the Christian world. His name was Julian of Hungary, a Dominican friar who travelled to the eastern borderlands of Rus in 1237, searching for pockets of ethnic Hungarians who had remained in the original Magyar homeland when the main migration moved west to the Pannonian Basin centuries earlier. In the course of his travels, he learned of the Mongol army assembled on the Volga. He wrote a letter to the Pope's legate in Hungary, addressed to a specific bishop, that deserves to be much better known than it is. Julian described meeting Mongol messengers who had been detained by Yuri II of Vladimir. He described an army that was waiting, not yet moving, but waiting for winter, waiting for the rivers and swamps to freeze. Because frozen ground was better for cavalry movement than the soft, muddy landscape of autumn and spring. The Mongols were not, Julian's letter makes clear, going to charge west immediately. They were going to wait for the conditions to be right. They were planning. That letter reached Hungary. It was read by people who should have acted on it. It was not acted on adequately. The road to Vienna ran through Bolghar. Bolghar was gone. Europe had been warned, and it was not ready. The fall of Volga Bulgaria was not the end of the 1236 campaign season. It was the opening act. And the Mongol command did not pause to consolidate or celebrate. They kept moving. Through the remainder of 1236 and into 1237, the army turned its attention to the remaining peoples of the steppe between the Volga and Don rivers. The Kuman Kipchaks, who had been the persistent steppe nemesis since the 1220s, and who had provided fighters to the coalition that clashed with the Mongols at Khalkha in 1223, were subjected to a sustained campaign of attrition and forced submission. The Alans in the foothills of the northern Caucasus, who were pushed out of the steppe onto less accessible terrain, but could not ultimately be defended from a committed Mongol assault, were crushed in sequence. The Burtas, the Moksha, and the Erzia, the Mordvin peoples who had allied with the Bulgars and provided fighters in 1223, were defeated or compelled into the Mongol force as auxiliary troops. There was a battle of particular significance at the Sura River. Historical sources refer to the Zolotarevsko engagement, named for an archaeological site near the river crossing that excavations have confirmed was the scene of a major violent event in the mid-13th century. It appears to have been a coalition of surviving Bulgar nobles, Mordvin fighters, and possibly other steppe groups, making a final organized stand at a strategic river ford. The archaeological layers at Zolotarevsko show evidence consistent with a major military engagement weapon, deposits human remains in disarray, and signs of rapid violent destruction. This appears to have been the last significant organized resistance east of the Russian principalities. When it was defeated, there was nothing more between the Mongol army and the frozen Volga. In November 1237, Batu Khan sent envoys to the court of Grand Prince Yuri II of Vladimir Suzdal, the same Yuri who had been burning Bulgar towns and cutting Bulgar trade routes just 15 years earlier, and demanded his submission. The Russian chronicles record that Yuri refused, that he treated the Mongol ambassadors with contempt, that he dismissed the threat with the kind of confidence that comes from having never seen what was coming. He had seen what happened to Volga Bulgaria. Everyone had seen what happened to the Volga Bulgaria, and it was not enough to change his calculus. That failure of imagination, the inability to look at the smoking ruins of a civilization and recognize that the same thing was coming for you, would cost the Russian principalities everything. On December 16, 1237, the Mongol army besieged Ryazan, the city held for 6 days. When it fell, it was not captured in the sense of being occupied and administered. It was destroyed so completely that when the people who escaped eventually tried to rebuild, they did not rebuild on the same site. They built a new city several miles away. The ruins of old Ryazan still lie where they were left in December 1237. An archaeological site outside the modern city, silent testimony to what the Mongol army was capable of when it chose to make an example. Vladimir, the capital of the most powerful Russian principality, fell in February 1238. The royal family died in the flames. Yuri II himself assembled a new army and was annihilated at the Battle of the Sit River on March 4, 1238. He was killed in the fighting. In a single winter campaign, the most powerful state in Russia had been eliminated as a military force. Back in Volga Bulgaria, predictably, the surviving Bulgar nobility attempted to reassert themselves. When the main Mongol force moved west into Russia, the occupation forces left behind were lighter than the main army. The Bulgarian aristocrats who had survived by submitting now rose in rebellion, mobilizing local forces and attempting to restore some measure of independence. This was not irrational. It was what any surviving leadership class would attempt in their circumstances. The Mongols came back. The rebellions were crushed. Then the main army moved west again. Over the following decades, Volga Bulgaria was absorbed into the Ulus Yochi as the administrative structure of what would become the Golden Horde took shape. Bulgar was rebuilt, not as a Bulgar city, but as a Golden Horde trading and administrative center. Ironically, under Mongol suzerainty and the Pax Mongolica that the Mongol Empire imposed on the Eurasian trade routes, Bulgar eventually grew larger than it had ever been before the conquest. The trade that had made Volga Bulgaria prosperous continued, but the profit now flowed to Mongol administrators and Mongol clients rather than to the Bulgar ruling class. The Kipchak language gradually supplanted the Bulgar Oghuric tongue as the dominant speech of the region's Muslim population. The cultural identity of the place was slowly transformed. The descendants of the refugees who fled to the northern forests became over time the Volga Tatars and the Chuvash, the peoples who inhabit the Republic of Tatarstan and the Chuvash Republic today, and who still regard Bolghar as their ancient spiritual capital. When UNESCO designated the Bulgar archaeological complex a World Heritage Site in 2014, it did so with language recognizing the site as a symbolic reminder of the acceptance of Islam by the Volga Bulgars in 922 and a sacred destination for Tatar Muslim pilgrims. The memory of what was lost in 1236 has not entirely died. It persists in heritage and faith passed through centuries of transformation. Let me step back from the specific events and make the argument that I think is most important about this entire episode, the argument that the fall of Volga Bulgaria deserves a central place in any serious account of the Mongol Western campaign, and that the reason it has been neglected is largely an accident of whose history gets told. The fall of Volga Bulgaria in 1236 is not just an event in the history of a Turkic Muslim kingdom on the Middle Volga. It is the first domino in a sequence that would within 5 years reach the Adriatic Sea. And the sequence moved with a speed and ferocity that the world was absolutely unprepared for, despite having in Julian of Hungary's letter and in the visible example of what happened to the Bulgars, more warning than they had any right to expect. The progression after 1236 is worth tracing in sequence because it shows how precisely Subutai had planned the entire operation. Volga Bulgaria was cleared in autumn 1236. The Cumans, Alans and Mordvins were reduced by 1237. The Russian principalities, one after another through the winters of 1237 to 1238, Ryazan in December, 1237, Vladimir in February, 1238, Yaroslavl Kostroma, Tver Torzhok, and a dozen other cities in the same brutal winter campaign. The Grand Prince Yuri II was annihilated at the Sit River in March 1238. Then a pause, not retreat, but consolidation, and continued operations against the steppe peoples. In 1239, the Mongols returned to Russian territory. Pereyaslavl fell, then Chernihiv. In December 1240, Kyiv, one of the largest cities in Eastern Europe, home to perhaps 50,000 people, the political and religious heart of the Russes' civilization, was sacked so thoroughly that the Franciscan friar Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, traveling through the area 4 years later in 1245, reported finding skulls and human bones scattered across fields for miles. He could not find enough surviving inhabitants to get accurate information about the city that had existed. Kyiv had effectively ceased to exist as an urban center. Then in the spring of 1241, the invasion of Central Europe. The army split into coordinated columns operating simultaneously across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Danube. One column swept through Poland. Lublin burned, Krakow abandoned, Wrocław abandoned. A combined Polish-German and Teutonic order force under Duke Henry II of Silesia, a serious army by European standards of the time, was annihilated at the Battle of Legnica on April 9th. The same day Mongol forces were fighting in Transylvania. 2 days later, on April 11th, Batu Khan and Subutai's main force shattered the Hungarian army of King Bela IV at the Battle of Mohi on the Sajo River. Two of medieval Europe's most significant kingdoms were militarily broken in the same week. By December 1241, the Mongol advance elements were on the Adriatic coast. Batu and Subutai were finalizing invasion plans for Austria, Germany, and Italy. The road to the Atlantic was militarily open, and then Ögedei Khan died in his tent in Mongolia. Every Genghis prince of blood was required by the laws of the Yasa to return to the homeland for the election of a new great Khan. Subutai reportedly argued against withdrawal. He knew what was being surrendered. But the law was the law, and Batu could not continue the campaign without the princes who made up the core of his command structure. The Mongol army withdrew from Central Europe in the spring of 1242, and Europe, by the narrowest of margins, survived. I want to be very direct about something because I think the historical record demands honesty here. Europe did not defeat the Mongols. No European army, no defensive strategy, no natural barrier stopped the Mongol advance. The Polish army was beaten. The Hungarian army was beaten. The Teutonic Knights were beaten. The fortified cities of Central Europe, with the partial exception of a few hill castles in Dalmatia that the Mongols chose not to invest heavily in besieging, fell or were evacuated. There was no Thermopylae moment. There was no last stand that held the line. Europe survived because a man died in Mongolia. That is the honest account, which makes it worth asking what would have happened if Ögedei had lived another 5 years. Subutai had shown repeatedly that he could sustain multi-year campaigns across enormous geographic distances. The logistical system that had maintained the Russian campaign through 2 winters was capable of supporting a continued advance west. The European armies that existed beyond the already defeated Polish and Hungarian forces were not obviously better than what had been destroyed. Subutai had intelligence agents who had traveled as far as Austria. He knew what was ahead. Most historians who have studied this question seriously conclude that there was no natural stopping point. The lack of steppe pasture west of the Hungarian plain, a constraint often cited, was real, but manageable for a force that was already operating in the partially forested terrain of Poland and the Carpathian mountain footholds. The Mongols had campaigned in environments with limited steppe forage before. The argument that they simply ran out of grass is not a satisfying explanation for why they stopped at the Adriatic. The real explanation is political Ögedei's death, the return of the princes, and the decade of succession conflict that followed between the Jochid Ögedeid Chagatai and Toluid branches of the family. Batu never got Subutai back. After 1242, the old general returned to Mongolia, where he died in 1248. Without Subutai, the strategic coherence that had made the Western campaign so devastatingly effective was gone. And the succession politics meant that a new, properly authorized Western campaign was never organized during what remained of Batu's life. Now trace that backward to Bolghar in 1236. The plan that ended at the Adriatic began with that campaign. Every subsequent victory against Russia, against Poland, against Hungary depended on the operational base that the destruction of Volga Bulgaria established the secured Volga corridor. The eliminated threat to the rear, the psychological message of inevitability, the demonstrated ability to crush even a people who had previously beaten the Mongols. Volga Bulgaria was not the prologue to the main story. It was the foundational chapter, without which the main story could not have been written. And Europe never adequately acknowledged what had been done on its behalf. The people who died in Bolghar in 1236 bought time for Europe to survive. They did not intend to. They were not sacrificing themselves for a continent they had no particular relationship with. They were just fighting as hard as they could for their own civilization. But the consequence of their destruction, and the year it took to accomplish it, shaped everything that followed. So let's bring this full circle. Volga Bulgaria, in its prime, was one of the most significant states in Eurasia. Muslim Turkic, prosperous, educated, sitting at the crossroads of a trade network that stretched from Scandinavia to Baghdad to China. Its cities were larger than most of medieval Europe's. Its scholars contributed to the Islamic intellectual tradition. Its merchants kept northern Europe supplied with the silver that made economies function. And it was briefly one of the only peoples in the 13th century who could genuinely say, "We beat the Mongols. We beat Subutai. We set a trap in the autumn of 1223 on the banks of the Volga. We sprang it at the right moment. We captured Mongol soldiers and sent them back to Genghis Khan in exchange for livestock. And we watched the most feared military force in the world limp away without achieving its objective. That is a real achievement. That matters." The Battle of Samara Bend is a genuine military accomplishment by a genuine civilization, and the fact that almost no one in the English-speaking world knows about it is a gap worth filling. But the story ends 13 years later with fire and bones and a people scattered into the northern forests. Not because they were weak, not because they deserved what happened, but because a mobilization decree was issued in Karakorum, because a 60-year-old military genius planned a double envelopment that neutralized their greatest advantage, because 13 years of patient attrition had stripped away the buffer zones and the allied peoples, and because no one, not the Russian princes, not the Islamic world, not any regional power came to their aid when the final campaign began. They fought it alone, and they lost it alone. The road to Vienna ran through Bolghar. When Bolghar fell, Europe had no idea how little time it had left. The Mongol army crossed the frozen Volga into Russia in December 1237, and within 4 years it had reached the Adriatic. The people who built the mosques and bazaars and schools of Bolghar never knew that their destruction was the precondition for everything that followed. They were simply trying to survive. The next chapter of this story, the invasion of Russia, the burning of Ryazan, the battle of the Sit River, the sacking of Kyiv, the destruction of everything the Kyivan Rus civilization had built. That is where we go from here. Because if this episode taught you anything, I hope it is that the Mongol Western campaign was not a series of disconnected raids by bloodthirsty horsemen. It was a single, coherent, planned, logistically sophisticated operation spanning years. And 1236 is where it truly began. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you. Genuinely. This kind of material takes significant research to get right, and the fact that you're still here at the end tells me you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel exists for. Please hit the like button. If you got something from this, it takes 2 seconds, and it helps this channel reach more people who care about the full story of history, not just the greatest hits version. Subscribe if you haven't. We are not done with this campaign, not by a long way. The road the Mongols cut through Volga Bulgaria runs all the way to Poland, Hungary, and the edge of the world they knew. We are going to follow it every step. I'll see you in the next one.